Organisation et à la Université de la Manouba pour l'invitation. Je parlerai en anglais, mais lentement. Mais des questions, peut-être je répondrai en français.
Merci pour l'effort.
I'm here as the head researcher of a project that has been running for a year now, based in the new University of Lisbon, the University of Lisbon, which has got funding from the Portuguese government. And it's a smallish scale project that is looking at what you see on the screen. But I'm sorry for the translations, maybe they're not entirely correct, but I've just used one of these things that you can today do, with the internet. Hypothèse sur les relations entre l'homme et l'animal dans le Portugal médiéval. And what we are trying to achieve with this project, which is a joint venture between my own research institution, which is the Institut pour des études médiévaux at the New University, together with two other organizations in Portugal. One of them is called Fauconnerie Real, the fauconnerie royale, which you can see on the left, and which is what is left of a big complex of buildings built in the 17th and 18th century in central Portugal, not far from the Tiago river that flows to Lisbon, and is the place where originally birds of prey, so these rapaces, were kept for the enjoyment of the Portuguese royal household. And today it still works as a falconry site. So you can still go there and look at the birds of prey and have a demonstration of what they can do in terms of falconry. So this is one of our partners. The other partner, which has been working with us, is the laboratoire d'archéosciences, laboratoire d'archéosciences. And they are very important to us for the fact that they work with the material remains of the birds. So as a team of specialists in history, in art history, in literary studies, and also in geography and anthropology, we have been trying to bring into the project several looks and several ways of looking at the aspects of human-animal relations in medieval Portugal. So we do have a zooarchaeologist in the team, but in LAAM they have a bone collection that we can use for matching the remains that we did not excavate ourselves, but we have been using from excavation records. So I'm here with two members of my team. So that's Afonso Souza and Diana Martins. Afonso is the full-time researcher for the project, and Diana, she works on, she's a doctoral student, and she is working on the circulation of the birds of prey tied to diplomacy. So, like I said, the main objectives of our project is to reinforce the multidisciplinary and pluridisciplinary research on the relations of us with other animals. And because it's a small-scale project, we have used falconry and birds of prey as a way of looking, as as a case study to look into these relations. So we have already set in place a work group that is trying to develop, critical thinking and lines of research along this objective. So based on social sciences and the arts and humanities, but also trying to extend to the natural sciences. And we are also developing a set of larger projects, a few larger projects, in terms of both the scientific lines of research and also the geographical and chronological range of our inquiry. So I will speak a little bit about generally human-animal relations in the Middle Ages, and then looking into falconry as a practice a little bit. So I will go through explaining what hunting was in the Middle Ages, and also what falconry has to do with hunting in the Middle Ages. And finally, what the history of falconry, where we can find falconry historically, what it may tell us about the history in the long duration, in the long durée of these practices around the Mediterranean. So in a wider sense of cultural practice. So as we all know, animals have been used for food since always. So they are a way for us to feed ourselves. And this also obviously involves chicken, sheep, mutton, bovine cattle, swine cattle, fish, sea mammals, so a huge variety of animals that are used for our diet. But also, as you can see in this 14th century illumination, they are used for work, and in the case of horses there, but also dogs and bovids as well, since very early times. So this is an example of a domesticated animal, but we need to also bear in mind that there are other animals that were not domesticated and lived in the wild, of course. And these animals in the wild, both large animals, small animals, include some animals that were hunted. Okay, so they became prey for humans as hunters. And finally, because we're speaking of the Middle Ages, there's animals that are not necessarily real, but in the medieval mindset, they were as real as any other animal. So this is an example of a medieval bestiary of a unicorn that sits along other animals, with horses and foxes and whatever you can think of, as another animal that you may not have seen it yet, but people assumed it was around. Like I said, for the remit of this project, the team has been focusing on birds of prey. And these birds of prey, we can find them everywhere, a little bit everywhere in the Portuguese sources for the Middle Ages. So this is an example from the 13th century, I believe, from northern Portugal. I think it's a bear. In this case, I couldn't find anything with a bird, but it's a bear. But there are lots of representations of a variety of animals. So this is in a church. You can find them in literary works of fiction, in poetry, for example, in a variety of genres from the literary records of the country. You can find them also in the chronicles, which, as you know, was the way of those who commissioned these chronicles wanted and wished to portray themselves, how they wanted to be seen, and falconry and birds of prey is an element that very much repeats itself in Portuguese chronicles. Then I will speak a little bit about this later on. We have for Portugal, especially from the mid-13th century onwards, we also have technical treatises, which we may think of as the first books of animal medicine that we have examples for the European Middle Ages. And then we also have a body of legislation that reminds us of the fact that we coexisted, or back then people coexisted on a day-to-day basis with these animals. So legislation saying what to do with them, what not to do with them, the fines you had to pay with if you, for example, if you caught a bird of prey in the, the eggs of the bird of prey in the wild. For example, a law from the mid-13th century said that you could not do that. You could pick one egg but leave the rest, and not bother with not tame with the rest of the birds, so that the species could keep going and not disappear. And even in the geography today, we still find today place names in Portugal that are directly tied to these animals. The Achour mountain, which is the mountain of the hawk. There's literally dozens of places that are still reminders of this relationship from the past and how these animals inhabited the landscape. So on to my next point. So one key aspect of these birds of prey, the rapaces, so between eagles or accipiter and falcons, the fauconnerie. One of the key aspects when dealing with these birds of prey in the Middle Ages is to hunt with them. Okay. So, of course, this does not begin with the Middle Ages. So, hunting. This is from the caves in Altamira in Spain, today's Spain, about 15,000 years old. So, hunting was, and in some societies still is, a feature of all human civilizations historically since prehistoric times. And is ultimately an act of survival. So you had to hunt in order to get food, of course. So this means that it was practiced by every echelon in society for their own subsistence. And goes without saying that smaller prey, smaller quarry, required less means for catching, for hunting. They had to be clever, but the means available, I mean, a single person or a couple of people could actually, catch a sparrow or a rabbit. It was not a huge undertaking in terms of workman force. But bigger prey, and there we find bigger cervids, but bigger prey in this period and later demanded teamwork and also better technology, but also teamwork for success. So this teamwork would involve several people concentrating on the same prey, and also people as hunters being assisted by animals, which we don't see there, but we will see in the next one. more or less. It's a bit small, but you can see these dogs here, for example, and they're helping the archers to hunt down those deer. So they're chasing the deer in the direction of the archers there, and the crossbowmen there. So horses, which we don't see there, but we know existed. Horses, dogs, and also birds of prey were part of this collective undertaking of hunting together to catch bigger prey. Okay? So because of its own nature, of it being a collective activity that demanded some resources that one or two individuals might not have access to. Already by the Middle Ages, in Europe, hunting of big animals, and we're thinking of bears, the deer, the cerf, the boar, the sanglier, were practiced by the rich and powerful only, and started being considered as a practice that was exclusive to the elites. And this is true for everywhere, and Portugal also included, since the time that these resources were used together. So for Portugal, I will give you three examples. One, it's a quite early one. Andrea spoke about Myrtle already before, and this is a mosaic. It depicts a falconer. Perhaps you don't see it too well, but this is supposed to be a bird of prey. On his arm, his forearm. And the setting of this, so that's Myrtle there in green, and it's a really nice place to visit, by the way. So the setting of this falconer, this is only a small remain of a bigger mosaic, of course, but it's a falconer on horseback. And this dates to the period of the late Roman Empire and perhaps also already the transitional period of when the Romans start to decline, and there's the presence of the Germanic invaders, which in this case were the Visigoths. So we're talking about 5th, 6th century here. So this is the earliest visual depiction that we have of falconry being practiced in what today is Portugal. So quite early, so back in the 5th or the 6th centuries. Not too far from Mercula is Tremores. Oh, actually, I had another example from before this, so I'll refer to my earlier example, which is one document of 1117. So this is right at the beginning of the period of Portugal becoming independent as a polity. So the mother of the first Portuguese king is involved in, according to this document dating from 1117, so 1117. 1117, makes sense. Okay. And what this document says is that this a sword, a ghost hawk. I'm not sure what the French word is for ghost hawk.
Can you repeat it?
Est un épervier. So the document, what it says is that this bird of prey is being donated to a local nobleman. And we have another document around the same period, a bit later than this one, actually. But not too far chronologically, that confirmed that these birds of prey were seen as a valuable good and were used in these transactions between noble people. So yeah, so going on to this one, this is later than the two examples I mentioned. So this is from the 14th century, and is the side slab of a tomb, so his resting place, of this knight. He's called Vasco Esteves de Gattuso. He died in 1363, 1363. And he's buried there in that part of Portugal, within the medieval city walls, in the Church of St. Francis in Estremoz. And this is very clear. You can see here how the whole ensemble for hunting is displayed. So you have the guy himself, so the knight there on horseback with his bird again resting on his wrist, and then you have the other, dogs that are helping out with the hunt, and then you have a couple of other guys that one of them is carrying a special kind of lance to probably used for boar hunting, so wild pig hunting, and he's also blowing a horn, a hunting horn, and then we have another individual there also helping with the hunting process. So we see here that not only this activity carried on being executed, hunting, but keeping in line with what we saw in the other illumination, which is roughly also from the same period, a few decades later, which I forgot to mention, but it comes from a French context. Okay, so this is a language, the language of falconry, the language of noble hunting, aristocratic hunting, that sweeps across Western Europe. And we'll see that not only Western Europe, but you can find it both in terms of the time span and also the geography where it keeps being practiced. So, what is the connection of all this that I've been trying to tell you about and the southern Mediterranean? Okay, to tell you a bit more about this, and I know there's people here who know a lot more about this than I do here. But in order to understand this a little bit better, and these ties that will bring this together with the Mediterranean context, we need to go back to the historical origins of falconry. So what we see here is a map telling us that although falconry most likely began in this area here, shown in brownish color, so in the Eurasian steppes. So Mesopotamia, between Mesopotamia and Mongolia, so in the Mesopotamia in the west and Mongolia in the east, and the region in between, maybe about 4,000 years ago. This is where the earliest records seem to exist for. But you can see that although it was already in its beginning covered a very large chunk of the of Eurasia, it then spread, and that's the shade of green. It then spread, both north, south, west, and east to become a practice that covers really the 3 continents. So the reason for falconry having developed as a form of hunting came largely from the observation of how our observation, as people, us observing how these birds of prey behaved in the wild. So they would predate upon smaller birds and also smaller mammals, such as the wild rabbit, such as the pheasant, that were very helpful also to our own food habits. So the prey that was taken by these winged hunters was the same that humans welcomed in their diet. And this is common to the spread of falconry in this map. So we believe that falconry entered Europe in several waves. It's impossible to tell exactly when this happened, but it's likely that as a hunting technique, falconry was already being used in Europe in the late 4th or the 5th century. It's a bit confusing, the map, but it will show you mostly what the first. This shows you how Europe looked like, Western Europe and basically the Mediterranean and Europe north of the Rhine. How it looked like in terms of the people who were then moving across the region during the period that we call the migration period. So, from the east came the Huns in about the late 4th century, and it's believed that there's a likelihood that it was the Huns who first brought falconry into Europe. Okay? And then after the Huns had moved across to what is today Germany and France, they cast away other. This is the part that you know a lot more than I do. That's the good news. Yeah, very good. And they actually pushed the tribes that were based in this region, such as the Visigoths and the Slavs, but the Visigoths mostly. They pushed them to this area here, so today Spain and Portugal. In the 5th century. So, and we know from records that the Visigoths were familiar with falconry. So we do see that, culturally speaking, in terms of these civilizations that are tied to falconry as a hunting practice, we can see this movement sort of coming from the east and then spreading to this area here. So we can see this mosaic I showed you earlier as a part of this movement. So it's a natural consequence of this big migration of peoples that originally came from the east. So another. I should probably also mention that when the Visigoths entered the Iberian Peninsula, they pushed the people who were already there, the Vandals, and they ended up here in Carthage, in Tunis, so in modern day Tunisia, in what back then the Roman province of Ifriqiya. But I will come back to this a moment on. But you can see now that it does this. So it basically does this. It comes from here and then it kind of swoops it brings in another side of the issue, which makes it the more fascinating, even I think. Comes with the direct contact of Western Europeans with Syria from the 11th century onwards, with the Crusades. Okay, so the Crusades, as we all know, moved around the Mediterranean to Palestine, the Holy Land, and also incidentally one of the Crusades, the last Crusade, called at Tunis. So just to remind us that these places around the Mediterranean were interconnected in terms of voyaging, travel, and trade, right? So I have a nice scene of people just, going on with their crusading. And the consequence of this is that the input in terms of knowledge as far as falconry goes, and in terms of the techniques employed, and what was being used as a falconry practice was not exactly the same as was practiced before in Europe. I have a very important example to show you here. So this is what is considered to be the first great manual on falconry in the West. It's called the Arte Venandi. The Arte Venandi cum avibus, so the art of hunting with birds. And it was written by this chap over there, Emperor Frederick II, around the mid-13th century. But what's interesting about this is probably two things that I should probably point out here, among other interesting things, is that Emperor Frederick II, he also had another work on falconry developed, which is called the Scientia Venandi per Aves, so the science of hunting with birds, which is really a veterinarian treatise on taking care of these birds. And this was not out of his own mind that he came up with this. This is really a translation into Latin of an Islamic scholar, Mohammed, dating back from the 9th century, that most possibly came through these reinforced contacts with the East because of the Crusades. Okay? Another source that Emperor Frederick II uses for the Scientia was a Persian falconer called Hadrif, even earlier than this, in the 8th century. So you can already see these several influences coming together. So to wrap this up, this part of my talk. Central and Western Europe have come into touch with falconry north of the Mediterranean, through mostly north of the Alps, through peoples and areas north of the Alps, and also during the Crusades directly from the Holy Land, probably using the Mediterranean routes by sea. But the southern areas of Europe and the Iberian Peninsula have received influences from another source. So the southern Mediterranean, through the influence of the Islamic expansion west of the Arabian Peninsula. So let's see how. So this is the first centuries of the expansion of Islam, starting of course here in Arabia, moving to Persia, the Byzantine Empire, and westwards to Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and so on. So through the Maghreb and into the Iberian Peninsula in the 8th century. So during the Abbasid and the Umayyad Caliphates, the Arabic civilization spread throughout Persia, across the Fertile Crescent, as I said, into Egypt, and beyond Egypt to the Maghreb. So Carthage was taken by the Caliphate in 698, and it already had been under Vandal rule, and also, of course, back then under Byzantine rule. So these Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula got entangled and got mixed together with the region's own civilizations, and in terms of their own culture also, of course, this was also the case. Now, I like this image because we see this is kind of how the thing goes. So this guy here is from Mongolia. They still do falconry there with eagles. This guy here is from the Arabian Peninsula. And of course this is a 16th century European prince, all living together with their own birds. So just to make it clear that these things are working, working together in a sense. So a few words about the Arabian falconry, because it's important to notice a couple of differences here, and a few characteristics that set apart Arabian falconry from the Germanic tradition that comes from the Vandals but onto the Visigoths. So the Bedouin tribes from Arabia had themselves developed their own falconry traditions, like I said, and these were based on making the most of a desert, a very barren environment. So, and as they entered, so you can see they're using camel, they're using local breeds of horse, they're doing using local breeds of dogs. This is, of course, a contemporary picture, but from the records we know that the practice of using these animals was there before, also in this period. I need to thank Madame Henri Fudaya from yesterday. Because she pointed our attention to this mosaic, which is in the Bardo, but comes originally from Carthage. You can't see it too well. This was the only picture that I could find on the internet. I'm sorry, but this is a falconry scene. The dogs, the rabbits being chased away, and a bird of prey. And in the far left, there's a guy on horseback. We don't see one of his hands, but he's got the visible hand up in the air. And he's riding a horse. And this is known as the Vandal rider. So this dates from the late 5th to the early 6th century. And as such, shows us what the local techniques of falconry were here in modern-day Tunisia. So, and these techniques, which are not, if you think back of that mosaic that we've seen for Mertola, I couldn't find a better picture, but I've seen it yesterday in the book. They're very, very similar in terms of composition, besides being, from the same period. But also in terms of the practices they show. They're very, very similar, and they're both of a Germanic sort of tradition. And this Germanic sort of tradition that we find here in the 5th century, the 6th century, of course, then impacts with the Arab falconry that that is coming in from the east, from Arabia, in the 7th century. Now, I don't know enough about falconry practices in Islamic Ifriqiya to say more about these cultural encounters, but I can tell you more a little bit about what was going on in the Iberian Peninsula after the Muslim invasion from 711 onwards. So the I'll go back to that in a moment. So just to remind ourselves, so from that map we've seen that the Abbasids and then the Umayyad Muslims made this kind of trajectory over the southern Mediterranean and then entered the Iberian Peninsula in the early 8th century. Okay? And then they stayed in the Iberian Peninsula until, in the case of Portugal, they were substituted, politically speaking, by the European Christians in the mid-13th century. So about 500 years of active presence and cultural presence, civilizational presence in today Portugal and Spain, in fact. So the question I want to be asking for the last leg of this talk is, and this is really the start of our investigation. So this is really sort of asking questions and not having yet the answers for them, although the prospect is quite exciting because we do see these things, coming together. Could the Iberian Peninsula and Portugal in particular, just because we're dealing with Portugal today, during the Middle Ages, could this region have served as a melting pot for falconry from Romano-German origins and Arabic origins? A little bit like, I've realized this from yesterday, literally, a little bit like Tunisia, maybe in the 6th century. So to come closer to this question and to add detail to some of the ideas I talked about before, we need to bear in mind the following three aspects: the nature of landscape and the natural resources we find, the species of birds being used for falconry, depending on where we are, and finally the cultural and social preferences, because we again are speaking of the elites, people with money, people with the power to train, own falcons, pay someone to train them. What the preference of these people were. And this combination of elements will determine the type of falconry that you have on the ground. So now I need to be a little bit more technical about the very little I know about falconry in practice to make this a little bit more clear. So falconry generally, historically, divides into two main types. The haut-vol, right? Haut-vol. And the bas-vol, okay? So bas-vol is what you will get is with flying mostly hawks, accipiter, so the gauche hawk, the sparrow hawk, which you find, for example, in the Black Forest there. Okay? So it's woods, it's closed ground, is thick nature, so you'll need birds that will go in a straight line from your fist into the woods and catch on sight the quarry there. Okay? So this is the kind of Germano-Roman thing that I was talking about, because it comes from North Europe, right? And then you have the hovo, for which the other types of birds of prey are used, so mostly falcons. And these falcons are, this is the type of thing that you will find in Arabia, in the Arabian desert. And it's a completely different type of falconry, because you do have the bird on your fist, but then, because it's a completely different landscape, once a potential quarry is found, well, actually it's not this way around. So you release your bird, the bird will go around and around in circles, up and down. So the falconer, a good falconer, will actually determine how high the bird will go. And then, when it sees its prey, it will kind of, like an arrow, it will go down on its prey, or it will chase its prey until it gets its prey. Okay? So this is called the hook. And it's possible because, I mean, a bird over there is all desert and you can see where it is. I mean, it's a completely different type of thing. So this is the first determinant of how falconry is played out. The second determinant is the type of bird that you're using. Okay? So the hawks belong to ourselves and using a modern taxonomy, but one of the things that we're trying to determine in this project is how far back this natural scientific approach of telling these species apart was already being used and how. But the sources seem to go together rather well in terms of saying what the hawks were. So, and they basically fall into our modern category of accipiter. So, like the ghost hawk, the autour des ballons, épervier, non? Autour, oui. Merci. So, and you can see that the autour map, so it this is a modern day map. We do not have the genetic evidence, which we would very much like to have the genetic evidence for before. We don't exactly know where this prey was found, but we know that today, in modern day, this is well, it's actually more than this, but I just focused on Europe and the Mediterranean and Russia. So it's north of the Mediterranean. So it matches where what I was saying before. Because of its own characteristics, the autour is suited for this bas vol type of falconry. We were discussing yesterday when looking at the mosaics what the kind of bird that these characters have, both in Mertula and in Carthage. They seem, to the naked eye, they seem like a ghost hawk. But I mean, we need more research into this. Another type of bird, which you'll see is quite different in how it distributes, is the sacre falcon, the faucon sacre. So the sacre is everywhere but Europe and the Mediterranean. I mean, a little bit here, where we are, but mostly it's found in the steppes and Arabia. So, and it's a bird that is, you can see it here in the desert, I mean, perched on finally, so the most ubiquitous bird of all is the falcon peregrinus, the faucon peregrinus, which is a bit, about everywhere. But it's not as simple, because the falcon peregrinus subdivides into what we know today is 19, or depending on the authors, it could be 20 something, it could be less than that, subgenus, subgenera. It becomes very interesting to notice that even for, and now I'd like to bring in the third aspect, besides landscape and the birds, the social and cultural preferences. So what seems quite interesting, and now I'm sort of nearing the end of the talk, what seems very interesting, although we're talking about the peregrine falcon as a whole, like that, we already have our medieval authors from the Iberian Peninsula telling apart these three subspecies: the Pellegrinoides, the Babylonicus, and the Madens, I think. So basically, this here, number 8, number 7, and number 6. Pellegrinus, no, the Pellegrinus brucae, and Pellegrinoides, which they called very distinct. They look more or less the same, but for the Spanish Castilian writer Pedro López de Ayala, writing in the late 14th century, there was the falcon Nerli, which is the falcon of the north, which we today know as the falcon pellegrinus. There was the falcon Bahari, from the North Mediterranean, the falcon pellegrinus brucae, and the falcon Tagarote, which is the falcon that you can only find typically south of the Mediterranean in the Maghreb, which is the falcon pellegrinus pellegrinoides. So these species were, all three of them, so the peregrine falcon, the saker falcon, and the goshawk were all known to this Castilian author, Pedro López de Ayala, in the late 14th century. He knew all of them. He knew about not only Ayala, but he comes from the tradition of 13th century and 14th century Western European writers that in turn draw from an earlier tradition of Arabic writers, and he was a courtier, so he was a nobleman in the Castilian court, so he knew the king personally. He frequented the court of the later 14th century Castilian king. And one of the interesting things he says in his Libro de la Casa de las Aves, which is one of these treatises, he, for example, mentions conversations he had with mariners in the Mediterranean, bringing a type of bird from the Barbary. The Barbary was what they called the Maghreb. So, and he said they were bringing alphanets from Barbary. I don't know what the Arabic word is or the French word is, but we call them alphanek. Alphanek is the word that we still use today for a type of falcon, which comes directly from the Arabic. So he was saying that these birds are being brought into the Iberian Peninsula. So I'll just finish off by using some examples for one from each century to say a few words about it, rather than the natural flow of these birds due to migration. You find these migration cycles in Gabon and Al-Hawaria today. So these are the natural migration cycles from nature of these birds. But then we have man-forced migration, which is what I'm talking about now. And I will give you a couple of examples just to show you how these transactions were being made from the south of the peninsula to the north of the peninsula, and maybe the other way back. We still know even less about that than we did from south to north. I mentioned this example from the 14th century with the alphabet coming into the Iberian Peninsula. In this case, coming into here, Aragon, when you were part of Aragon in the 16th century. In the 15th century, a bit later, we have, for example, in 1427, we have a Portuguese clergyman who lives in Florence. There, he lives in Florence, and he asks for. He is asked for by someone in Portugal for a male goshawk to be sent from Florence to Portugal. Later on in the 16th century, in 1522, the Portuguese king issues an order to the local collector, the Al-Sharif, in Ceuta here. So this is the early 16th century. He issues an order for meat to be purchased to feed the falcons that were being taken from North Africa to the royal court in Lisbon. And just to finish things off with just an interesting thought about 13th century Tunis, of course, which again you'll all know much more about than I do. But in 13th century Tunis, the Andalusians were becoming a strong presence in Tunis. People from Cordoba, from Seville, which incidentally were big courtly centers for falconry in medieval Castile. And of course, people in Tunis and people in central Iberia, so you've mentioned Aragon, Portugal, and now Castile, were in contact in terms of trade and commerce and culturally speaking as well. So this does not tell us anything specifically about falconry and the exchange of birds of prey, but it might in the future. So this is all prospects of future research. I hope you like it.
Merci Tiago pour cette pertinente présentation. La représentation ainsi que la présence des animaux dans la vie sociale à travers notre ère archéologique ainsi que les œuvres d'art, les centres de chasse et le rôle de ces animaux, en particulier à Rapaces. Les perspectives de recherche dans ces
Attrape, c'est ça?
Non, je fais ça, je combine, etc.
Ah,
c'est la camouflage.
La camouflage, par exemple.
Malheureusement, ils ont laissé cette tradition à part. Ils ont utilisé des filets fixes, nuit et jour. Ils capturent toutes les sortes de l'oiseau. C'est vraiment. Il faut arrêter ça.
D'accord. Donc, André a
c'est une question, parce que je ne sais pas, je dirais que quand on regarde la scène à l'entourage, au moins je ne sais pas mon époque, hein, mais je pense qu'il interprète le cosmopolitisme de la ville après le 16e ou 7e siècle comme une connexion avec le sud, c'est avec la Méditerranée. Même tout ce qui est, par exemple, les tombes qu'ils ont trouvé avec des noms grecs et tout ça. Donc ça semble que la puissance de Berthola au début du Moyen-Âge, ou à la fin de l'Antiquité tardive, c'est beaucoup plus connecté avec le sud, avec la connexion commerciale avec la Méditerranée, qu'avec le nord des collections germaniques ou quoi que ce soit. D'un côté. D'autre côté, je me souviens toujours de la puissance de la céramique africaine qu'on a chez nos sites archéologiques de cette époque. Donc c'est beaucoup plus, encore une fois, la connexion sud qui fait la puissance de la circulation des idées, soit tout ça. Donc je ne sais pas, pour Carthage, ça je ne sais rien, mais c'est une hypothèse, hein, que la présence de cette fauconnerie au sud du Portugal tellement tôt, je ne sais pas si ce n'est plus connecté à la branche méditerranéenne méridionale qu'à la connexion nord. C'est une hypothèse, parce que peut-être je ne sais rien sur le sujet.
Moi, je me demande, par exemple, chez nous, dans le domaine de la recherche scientifique, est-ce qu'on a des chercheurs, des doctorants qui travaillent sur cette thématique très intéressante, la fauconnerie, d'où le festival de Perrier, la région très célèbre, très populaire. Mais des recherches académiques sur cette thématique-là restent à faire. Une recherche des approches historiques et une approche du point de vue patrimoine matériel. Et c'est des termes à utiliser et il faut que les jeunes je pense à de tels sujets.
différentes de tous. Sur le point de vue du patrimoine culturel, très riche, parce que c'est une tradition millénaire vivante. Et des techniques de savoir-faire, des pratiques. D'accord, nous sommes au 21e siècle, mais 50e.
Est-ce que vous avez l'équivalent du festival de ville en Portugal, au Maroc,
Au Maroc, oui, il y a les Rapaces.
Portugal est pas
Il y a quelques grands fauconniers au Portugal.
D'accord.
25 grands fauconniers au Portugal.
Et donc c'est très populaire, toujours.
Oui.